Welcome back to the CreaTech stage at cogX Hybrid Festival 2021. cogX is a global leadership summit and festival of artificial intelligence and transformational technology, addressing the big question, how do we get the next 10 years right? I'm Leila Siddiqui, Associate Director Diversity at the IPA and member of the Creative Industries Council Diversity Group. I am your MC this afternoon, and CreaTech has had a stellar lineup of cutting-edge content from gaming, live performance, advertising, music, fashion, visual arts, and so much more. It is worth reinstating that CreaTech is unique in that it is the intersection of creative and technology industries where innovation in AI and VR, algorithms, specialized software, and others are transforming creative services, outputs, and processes. CreaTech at cogX 2021 is hosted by the Creative Industries Council and supported by associate partners Digital Catapult, Facebook, Moore Kingston Smith, and UKRI. Please join the conversation on social using hashtag CreaTechUK and hashtag cogX2021. You can find out more about CreaTech and the work of the Creative Industries Council at www.thecreativeindustries.co.uk. Additionally, applications are now open for our annual showcase of the best innovations in UK CreaTech called Ones to Watch. You can apply now at thecreativeindustries.co.uk. And finally, another piece of news is that the first in-depth research into CreaTech employment has been released today by TechNation and the Creative Industries Council. Find more on the TechNation website, technation.io. The report shares new light on sought-after skills in the CreaTech category, which is attracting record levels of venture capital investment. So our upcoming session is titled From Here to the Metaverse. Our speakers will explore what a virtual world really is, the vast opportunities they open up to society, to work and the arts, and how close we are to the tipping point. Ben Vickers, CTO at Serpentine Galleries, will be moderating this session. Ben is a curator, writer, publisher, and technologist. He is Senior Strategist at Large with the Serpentine in London and co-director of Ignota Books. Ben, a big welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Leila, and to the cogX team and everybody for joining us today. With global gaming population of over 2.7 billion, and the experience that we're still continuing of a fully digitized world since the onset of the pandemic, the metaverse has rapidly come to the foreground of everyday conversation. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with Herman today, to continue to discuss the metaverse with him and what Improbable is doing in that space. Throughout this session, if you want to share questions, please do. But to kick things off, Herman, I'm sure that there's many people in the audience who are well familiar with Improbable, but for those that are not, could you tell us a little bit about what Improbable does and why it's so important to this critical development of the metaverse?
Thanks for having us, for having me, Ben, and thanks to cogX as well for this. So Improbable is a virtual worlds company. We build the infrastructure and technology that enables complex virtual worlds to be easily built, run, and operated. And we break many of the limitations that have previously existed. So we can allow for massive, dense virtual worlds with thousands of people in them to interact together. And we also make it much easier just to run and build multiplayer games of all kinds. We also apply this technology to modeling real-world problems. And so we're in use today inside the UK defense apparatus and other areas that are using virtual worlds for practical real-world problem solving as well.
Thanks, Herman. So to get things started, it's funny because we actually had a conversation, I think maybe 7 or 8 months ago now. And back then we were talking in the frame of virtual worlds, but it's amazing what's happened this year in terms of the metaverse, like appearing in a litany of newspaper articles. I wondered, what do you think it is that's kind of capturing people's attention? And we've seen this rapid engagement with the idea of the metaverse.
So I think it's a little bit like the very beginning of the dot-com boom. And at the earliest time of the internet, I think a lot of people recognized that people are going to spend a lot more time online, that there was value in those experiences and there was some sort of opportunity there. And I think in the same way, people are saying, well, people are spending time online, in Zoom, in video games, in meetings. Maybe there's some amazing value in bringing it all together. But I don't think it's a very articulate passion yet. I think it's very much a sense of there being something there. And much like the dot-com boom, or perhaps, today cryptocurrency, although that's a whole side discussion, where there's smoke, there is some fire, but usually not where everyone thinks.
And I wondered, in terms of the metaverse, that it's a term that was coined in 1993 by Neil Stephenson. So in some ways, we've already had metaverses, right? We had Second Life. We've had a first run at this, kind of similar to VR. What do you think is really different this time? And
so,
should it be taken more seriously?
Yeah, I think once again, it's exactly like the dot-com boom. The business model problem for a lot of companies then was there just weren't that many people online. Internet connections weren't that fast. Most of the applications we're now engaging in, when the internet comes into its own, just weren't possible without solving a lot of technical problems. I mean, I remember a time just barely where building, running, and operating a website was an incredibly expensive proposition. You needed engineers and money, you had to run and scale servers. And we now take for granted a world where all of that is very convenient. So I think that same journey of infrastructure, technology, applications, problems, and users, that's what we're going through when it comes to virtual worlds in the metaverse. And I think it's going to be as big, as important a development as the improvements we saw with the internet becoming very mainstream. So what's different this time is the technology exists to actually do these things at really big scale. Users, billions of them, are now playing games and are engaged with virtual experiences. And I think there's a genuine need for a lot of problems that can only be solved through more complex virtual environments and virtual worlds.
Yeah, I think that it's really obvious that the technology is here and it's working, because just thinking about the term virtual production studio, looking at the way that a lot of films are now being produced, and kind of seeing video games engines enter into all of these different industries and actually proving kind of efficiencies from the get-go. I kind of feel like what we're seeing is that the video games engine sort of represents this new kind of interface technology that, AI, blockchain, all of these things that people have talked about having kind of for grounding innovation and kind of characterizing various hype waves. And so I really see this as being a kind of next internet, whether it's, with AR layers in the future, etc. Is that kind of how you see this unfolding? And is it as big as the next internet, or do you see it as something different to that?
I think we have to generalize a little bit and ask, what's the utility to people? What's the problem people are having solved? So video games are about entertainment, and to an extent, they're about distraction and a good time. I think as they become virtual worlds, what psychology shows us is that people aren't engaging in these games solely for entertainment. They're trying to fulfill really fundamental and important human needs that we normally get from hobbies, jobs, etc. Autonomy, competence, relatedness, the desire to learn how to become better at something, the fulfillment you get from solving problems, and the need we have to express ourselves, to explore new realities and ideas. We do this all the time. We've done this all the time with media, theater, novels, creativity in different forms. But games really give people a sense of agency and ownership over the worlds that they create, and an ability to really expand themselves, which we know correlates with really positive psychological outcomes. And I think if we think about what people really are doing, our brains are designed to engage with a very complex world. It's only natural that as we seek deeper and deeper engagement with virtual worlds, they become more and more complex too, right? If they're going to be sort of gyms for the mind, they're going to become more and more sophisticated over time. So once we establish that the purpose here is deep fulfillment, then you start to ask, well, how big can that go? How big an industry can that be? And the global games industry today is already almost $200 billion. And that's 100 billion more than when we started Improbable. So the rate of growth and the opportunity is really colossal. I think everything from music, concerts, new mediums of engaging with large numbers of people, being able to kind of own and run spaces, all of those things are much more possible than ever before. And, you mentioned the metaverse and the ideas from the 90s and the 80s. I think they're a bit like the ideas about space travel we had in the 20s and 30s, these really quaint ideas of people landing and having picnics on the moon. They were based on what we knew then about technology and about ideas. And what we know now shows us that future is a lot richer, a lot, perhaps very different from what we might have imagined then.
That's great. And And I think it's important to kind of draw us back to the beginning in terms of what you say of what Improbable is doing, right? Because you identify some specific things that are required in order to give rise to complexity in virtual worlds. And you hear things quoted like about the Travis Scott concert in Fortnite, that there were millions of people viewing that simultaneously. But I think what most people are not aware is that actually it was 150 people at a time experiencing that. So one of the things that Improbable is focused on is really scale and persistence. And we're gonna watch a video of a recent breakthrough on that. But
Well,
can you tell us a little bit about why scale is important?
Sure.
And what you're already beginning to see?
I would use the word density, not scale, but I like where you're going with this. So things like the Travis Scott concert, which was awesome, was an example of millions of people engaging with a pre-recording of an artist, no direct contact with the artist, but a pre-recording in groups of 100. And it was awesome. It was great entertainment. But if you think about when you fell in love with the first live concert you ever went to, thousands of people all around you. For me, it was Ultra in Miami, a real sense of presence, a powerful social muscle expressed, agency, you're part of a wave or an interaction with people. That really requires an order of magnitude more computational power. So something like a game of Fortnite might use what I would call operations per second. So the communication being exchanged, it might be at the number of a few thousand a second, which is quite a lot. The entirety of WhatsApp globally, so all the messages pinging in all the phones of everyone currently watching this, that's several million messages a second, meaningful communication events. But to actually do what we've accomplished and what you need to accomplish to kind of do bigger things, the numbers get a lot bigger. So once you show the video, I'll give a sense of what the numbers are. But the computational power and the challenge required to enable like thousands of people in the same place, it's just a whole other level. And the utility to people is much greater. You wouldn't enjoy a concert so much if it was just you and 3 people.
Yeah, I think with that, we've got to watch the video to give the audience a real sense of...
Welcome to Trinity P. This is our experimentation space. So what we've tested today is we've tested movement, coordination. I want everyone to jump. And we tested scale.
Oh my Lord, a sea of people.
Look at there is so much traffic. Oh, this is chaos. Party time on the platform. Hold the line. All right, now attack.
This has been amazing. It's been amazing to be in here with all of you. We love you.
Thank you so much.
We love you.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So what was it like? And where were you? I mean,
I was one of the giant avatars, so we should give a bit of context here. So this was an event we held as a surprise inside one of our live game scavengers, which we had privately been working on this event for a while and wanted to just show people rather than tell people about it. And we were surprised at the number of people that showed up, but we had, I think, at one point, 4,800 people in a single environment in this game. And unlike anything people had experienced before, everyone could rush to the same spot. Everyone could see everyone. Everyone could interact, wave flares and banners. And we even created a voice solution so that the giant avatars that we were could talk directly to everyone with no latency, as you would get normally on a small amount, but the same as a Zoom call as you would normally get on Twitch or something. So it became this like hybrid, massive live interactive event / social experiment with physics and combat and all of these things. And honestly, it felt like giving a theater production. It was really strange. I had performance anxiety. We all did. We came on and it was really wild. We asked 5,000 strangers to behave themselves on the internet. And they did. They followed instructions. They went along and they, I think there's lots of reaction videos on YouTube, etc. But it was just a different level of fun. And back to the numbers we talked about, that actually processes 250 million operations a second. And it uses various AI techniques to compress the bandwidth and do other things. We even had to invent new rendering techniques so that everybody could see everybody. That's the sort of level of challenge that's required to enable these deeply transformative experiences. And that's a game, but you could envision it being a world leader giving a speech to thousands of journalists and interacting with them in a more fun and casual way.
Yeah, well, that kind of leads on to the sort of next question of like having, in a way, I don't necessarily, maybe we can come back to talking a bit more about that experience. But like when you were experiencing that and you were seeing, you know, the technology works, we can bring this level of people together. What thoughts have you had about what's next? What is the context that you think that this could be most applicable to? Obviously, video games worlds having large battles, but obviously its potential goes beyond that.
Completely. I mean, to be honest, we've been sort of bombarded with opportunities since we revealed this, and it's not been very public. And everything from music to things we never even thought of. And I think what we're going to have to do is figure out not only what is the right environment to create the right social effect, but what are the right industries that are ready for that type of shift and transformation? Because one of my colleagues said it really well as we practiced this a few times, which is the skill required to manage a crowd, engage with them in a live setting, when you're also controlling an avatar, when they're also like sometimes misbehaving. It's almost a bit like going from like black and white to color TV or into the kind of talkies when, you know, you need new skills. And so I think it's going to take a different generation of performers and entertainers and hosts and, you know, game creators that can kind of understand how to do this type of stuff. So I think our goal is just to make it as available as possible, work with key partners and let them experiment and explore. But I imagine music will be one of the first places this technology goes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then political rallies. I was also thinking, it feels like there's also an application in the game world for kind of watching experiences, right? Because there's the kind of explosion of things like Twitch. When I was growing up playing video games, the idea of sitting and watching other people play video games was kind of an absurd thing. I think that's the point at which I realized I was old in relation to video games. So I can also imagine, you know, esports being like a very quick application for this.
The actual event got very meta. So we had a Twitch streamer in the event, streaming the event as a person. And one of my colleagues, who was Chris, the giant avatar, he noticed on his side monitor that was happening. And he called out that Twitch streamer, who then react shocked on his Twitch stream, brought him to the front, and we spawned hundreds of monsters for him to fight individually to the amusement of the other few thousand people. So like it starts to get really interesting, meta and strange and wonderful when you begin to connect these things together. And I think it adds to the layers of complexity and value that can be created. I don't think it takes away. I think I can imagine people Twitch streaming while also being kind of almost dungeon masters inside a game like this and controlling it for their fans.
Yeah.
But sports too. I mean, imagine watching a game this way.
Yeah, because also I remember when Snapchat first came out and you had this like bizarre experience of the kind of, you'd wake up in the morning and an event had happened and you'd have it from like 10 different people's perspective at different moments in time. And it feels like something similar to that could emerge from these kind of epic events that happen in video games, where it's not like straight on the screen. So a question has come in from the audience that feels relevant to bring in at this point is, why is it taking so long for developers to make these types of massive multiplayer experiences?
That's exactly why we exist. It's really, really hard. Like, it's really hard. It's taken us several years to get here, you know, and some of this work has been built alongside kind of government applications, you know, large scale training, all kinds of things. The underlying technology is a bit like starting again with building big complex websites. You know, you need all of the pieces. How do you distribute the work? How do you handle the communications and bandwidth? How do you support development environments that make sense? Just one small example, we had to create a system that actually created thousands of machines in the cloud to simulate the load of those players, log in, and then recreate their behavior with AI. So just testing this environment ends up becoming a major project that requires a lot of additional work. So we're really hoping we and other companies can kind of come together and make this problem a lot easier for other people to solve.
This is probably something you can't necessarily say, but can you give some indication to the magnitude of effort that it takes to go from 5,000 to say 100,000 to 1 million? Like, is that something that we're going to see in the next 10 or 20 years? Or
you know, this architecture that we've shown is not at all running at its limits. You know, we've actually, we've tested that to more than, I think this is public, we've tested that to more than 10,000 people simultaneously in the same spot. And I would reckon that there's more for it to go. Probably between 10 and 100,000 shouldn't require major architectural changes and approaches, but we don't know. And that's the next step. I don't see anything insurmountable in getting to those types of numbers. And bear in mind that, you know, those types of numbers reflect the total number of people currently playing most of the top games on Steam. they're in the hundreds of thousands of CCU at any moment in time. So if you can hit that, you can basically grab the majority of the live audience of a single big game, all in one space at one time. 1 million, that's a different level, right? How to get there. There's all sorts of problems. I think 100,000 is very achievable with the technology that exists today without having to invent something new. And Improbable would love to go in that direction.
Okay, and to take it kind of in that direction, this week I was reading this great book by the economist Mariana Mazzucato called Mission Economy. And in this book, she's making this very interesting argument about the amount of effort that goes into the first space race. And this idea that we need to have these kind of bigger goals, because what happens as a result of those bigger goals is you get all of these kind of external, unexpected innovations that then feed back into society. Now, it feels to me, a lot of people will be like, well, we've got a second space race going on right now. But it seems to me that planetary scale simulation is kind of up there with this kind of purpose of mission. And I wondered, what do you expect the kind of feeding back into society? What are the long-term impacts of this beyond the game context? And what's your vision within Improbable for that?
The other branch of technology we've worked on, again, less publicly, is how do you create artificial models of real-world systems? How can you be confident in their correctness? How can you analyze and integrate those models together and then answer what-if questions about the real world? So the biggest problem I think we face as companies and groups today and as governments is the world changes so quickly. We're constantly put into situations we've never encountered before and need to speculate on what might happen if we were to make a change. So building major simulations of our cities, our economy, our power grids, our cyber networks, all things that we've played with and done in different contexts. Those become very powerful tools, not for making decisions for people, not at all that, but for giving people an intuition of how things work. It's almost like we need to be in a mindset of perpetual rehearsal. And I think the biggest change we'll experience in society is governments and companies will just feel more competent when encountering new situations. We're going to become much more adaptable as a society. We're going to become much more long-term thinking. We're going to be able to democratize ownership over complicated ideas. If we can give the general public, for example, a disease model of COVID and allow them to play with it and come to their own, kind of get a sense of why things have been suggested the way that they are, visually, clearly, I think that could be a very powerful tool for education and for collaboration. I think the other thing I'd say is, if more of us are more fulfilled, we know that the psychological benefits of greater fulfillment from activities that really test you and stretch you, not all games, but some games in virtual worlds, those can really lead to very powerful outcomes for people. It can lead to better mental health outcomes. It can lead to, people being more tolerant towards one another, all sorts of positivity. And there's about 30 years of research on self-determination theory that backs this up.
And do you see the application of obviously the brain is like a complex thing to simulate, and we're seeing a lot of breakthroughs at the moment in that area. Is this something that you also foresee the application of Improbable's technologies working towards?
I think large-scale simulation could become a very powerful general purpose tool for a lot of things. At the moment, we're really focused on physical systems so we model people in large-scale groups, how they operate, how they interact with one another, how they spread ideas, those types of problems. But I could absolutely see applications in other areas too. Cell simulation, modeling biology, these are all modeling topics that in the future could become relevant. Today, it's not our focus, but we see ourselves as a virtual worlds company. And what we want to do is solve practical problems of virtual worlds as much as possible. And then a lot of the talk of the metaverse, no one's talking about practical applications. It's just like, yep, it'll be cool. But what will it do for me? Why do I want this? Why is this good for society? I think those are the questions we have to answer before embarking on these things.
Yeah, and on that note, if we think about other fields that are sort of in their infancy, very much kind of very tech orientated, for people that maybe are listening to this talk today or encountering the kind of concept of virtual worlds, but worlds are obviously made up of lots of different types of people, skills, etc. What would you say to, what do these worlds need? Do they need economists? What do you feel like is missing most from the development of this field?
I think really in a kind of plethora of different skills are required. I think games and games development have become very insular, and a major opportunity exists for people who are outside of those fields. You mentioned economists, absolutely. Social scientists, psychologists, people, mathematicians, frankly, even in modeling these systems. Like, we're struggling to even figure out how an improvement or a change to a virtual world is really going to impact the world over many iterations. We can't exactly test, efficiently with lots of people all the time. So there's a lot of speculation. I also think creatives as well, designers, thinkers, like if you're a stage or set creator in music, what do you do with this stage? What do you do with this set? How will you make that interactive? The problem with being an enabling company is we're an enabling company. We enable people, but we need people to enable, right? So if I could do anything in this talk, it would be to inspire more people to look at this space, which I think will also be a colossal market opportunity. I mean, just staggering.
Yeah, I agree. There's a question. I'd actually scrapped my blockchain question from my list, but since it's come in from the audience, I will ask it. They've phrased it this way: what can blockchain enable in metaverses that centralized technologies can't? But I think it would be useful to maybe also, obviously we're in this like NFT kind of peak hype wave, etc. And a lot of the applications of those technologies, whilst have turned up in my world of art, actually are much more geared towards kind of video game contexts. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that we got to be very, very careful in this space. Nothing we do, to be clear, involves the blockchain in any way. So I should make that disclaimer to begin with. It's just not that relevant because blockchains are about distributed trust. They're about creating opportunities where there isn't a need for central control or authority. But if you're simulating all of reality for a hypothetical economy, you're already being trusted to model the whole world. So having a database that stores how much money people have is not a much greater level of trust. That said, though, I think as virtual worlds become more complicated, the ability to trade items between them or own them could become very important. But I think people should be wary of garbage in, garbage out. If something wasn't valuable to begin with, suddenly making it exclusive and ownable doesn't make it more valuable, right? It doesn't. So there has to be a rich set of virtual worlds full of objects people really want to own and trade before this stuff becomes very relevant. And I think a lot of people are making a quick buck on it, which, like the dot-com boom, right? There's a lot of ideas that feel very exciting in the beginning, but when you really stop and ask, what's the market opportunity? How will this work out over time? It goes away. I think art, though, is an area where 100% I can see the relevance. I think art's probably ripe for this now.
Yeah. Despite spending 6 years working in that area, it didn't see the people coming. So I didn't quite think it was possible in the art context, but it clearly is shown to be, and it's clear that there's an entirely like new class of collector, etc., that are kind of entering that space. But maybe just to stay on the economics for a moment, because there's another question that came on that came through. Would love to hear your view on how the metaverse can drive people to spend more in the virtual world. And I guess that's a funny question in some ways, because I wonder if the person that asked that question is aware just how much people do spend in virtual worlds, and how big that economy is. I totally agree with you, Herman. Like, you have to make rich, incredible worlds, and then people produce certain things. But what are your thoughts in terms of how that kind of hybridization of the economy unfolds?
So virtual worlds don't monetize attention in the same way that other types of online service and activity do. So it's not about eyeballs and then selling them ads. I mean, you can sell people ads, but you're really taking away from the experience by doing that. Virtual worlds monetize the player value created through engagement and fulfillment of psychological needs. So I'll give you an example. If you build a world that has an amazing World Cup inside it, so it's an esport and it's an amazing cup, because that sport is widely played, because that game is considered fair and skillful and people aspire to be good at it, suddenly owning memorabilia from World Cup 95 or 2000 becomes valuable and becomes tradable and becomes something of note. This is really about human beings infusing things with value and meaning in complicated structures. And so virtual worlds, as they get more complex, they create more opportunities for people to invest, to have value, to have moments that matter. There's only so much you can monetize tic-tac-toe, right, versus World of Warcraft. No matter how popular tic-tac-toe is, what do you really sell in tic-tac-toe, right? Because there's just not enough depth to that. And so I think as games become more complex with technology like this, they will be more monetizable. A metaverse, though, a connection of different virtual worlds, I can imagine has wholly different levels of possible spending and value. But I don't look at it in terms of spending. I look at it in terms of player value. How can these things become more fulfilling? Because when they're fulfilling, it'll be easy to monetize them.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add something there in terms of personal experience in virtual worlds, I mean, there's a number of virtual worlds that existed in the past, and they're worth looking at because they had these kind of, strange examples like rares markets, where you had objects that were maybe glitches in the game, etc. And it was those objects that were not designed by the world, or anybody intended for them to be usable in the world, that took on the most value. So there are very kind of odd economies that emerge in this space. And I think what the metaverse really presents is the need to consider, when you're designing those objects in these worlds, that they might have a life in other worlds in the future. And people build up these kind of sentimental relationships with those objects.
No, I totally agree. I think that's a good example. I do believe we should throw caution, though, because the history of technology is littered with mistakes that were made by applying bad analogies to new things. So if we just think of three right now, Bitcoin is like gold. Not sure about that. Space travel is like railroads. Not sure about that. It's very easy. The .com boom will be like real estate. Well, no, people just change their names into things that they could find domains for, rather than the other way around, right? I think there's a really powerful cognitive technology we can all embrace, which is to go, how far does my analogy take me? So will there be rare items that people want to trade? Absolutely. But where will that value be created? Where does rarity come from in a world where things can be created instantly? Does it come from artificial scarcity? Does it come from player investment and ownership? Does it come from your memories? How will worlds interoperate? There's some really good questions you're throwing up here, and I think it'll take time for those to get worked out.
Yeah, and on that question of metaphors, maybe to take us, because I think that, a lot of the discussion right now around the metaverse is being framed in economic terms. And I think you're already seeing kind of poor results in the kind of blockchain context, because you just end up with a world of speculative assets, which isn't really very fun to play, not to name any particular worlds, but if you spend time in them, you'll know this. So maybe to take us like in a different direction, and something that we've talked about briefly before is this kind of idea of third place. And this is in reference to the coffee shops and the role that they played in industrialization, that you had this kind of other place within society where ideas and concepts and people met each other. And the coffee shop is perhaps, within its kind of historical trajectory, a more interesting metaphor. But what are the kind of metaphors that you turn to in thinking about how people are coming together in these spaces? I mean, we've had the town square, we've had the wall, etc. Are there specific ones that you think are relevant to this moment?
I think that's a challenging question for a lot of reasons, because it's one thing to speculate on technology, but we're now speculating on culture. And it's really hard to imagine the way things might be, because you're really speculating on your own change, your own psychology. But what I would say is, if you could take something like the Roman Colosseum, or a modern stadium, and make it much more participatory, much more a part of people's lives. So let's just imagine an example that I think about sometimes. Imagine if there was a sporting event every year that everyone participated in. It only happened once a year, but literally hundreds of millions of people, let's say, were part of it. And people talked about it for the entire year when they weren't part of it. Like almost like a benign version of going to war, but something that everybody was part of and did. It's a bit of a sandwich of ideas, but how might that affect society? What might that be like? It wouldn't quite be like sport is today. Yes, we all watch the World Cup if we're into football, but it would be very different from that. It would almost become a weird sort of social, like a filter and almost a source of social pride in its own self, and probably a pretty large economy. That's the kind of thing that's possible here. It's a bit like what happened with reality TV versus TV. If you went back in time and tried to explain reality TV to people who were creating theater productions before TV, they'd be very confused by why that was valuable and useful. And I think that mass participation, that's probably a good example. The other one, to your point of coffee shops, is something about mixing people together. I look at the movie Casablanca, and this idea of people with very opposing ideas who happen to find themselves communicating, interacting in the same space. We thought social media would be that, but it isn't, because of the echo chamber problem. Virtual worlds are much more likely to be that, because they force a reality upon you, a shared reality in which you sort of need to make decisions together and figure things out together. There's something very powerful about the empathy they can create. Of course, they have to be designed well. I could see this stuff bringing neighborhoods and towns and countries together in a really unusual way. It might even create the opportunity for a lot more of a physically distributed organizations having a virtual center, a place. And we started using this stuff for town halls, for example, which we think is really powerful. So this is an amazing field. I just think more people should be in it. It's really happening at the moment.
Yeah, that's an incredible point, actually, because I had a question I didn't ask earlier in terms of if you're building a world, if you're building these kind of new social spaces, how do you avoid the problems that have arisen as a result of social media that obviously weren't anticipated, because nobody could simulate that level of complexity ahead of everybody being in a same space. But the idea that virtual worlds lead to, rather than kind of critical commentary, they lead to critical construction because they're geared towards working together, I think is extremely powerful and like feels right to me in terms of where this kind of goes.
I think you raise an interesting point. I would only make one contradiction, which is I think it was more foreseeable than we realize. There were voices at the early days saying this wasn't a good idea. The historian Niall Ferguson talks about how printing presses are a good analogy. When the printing press was created, we thought it would create, well, it was a very religious time, and there was a view that it would create a society of priests because everybody could read the Bible. And one of the first books to start being spread was a crazy text about witch burning. And so it was shocking for me to learn that something like witch burning actually happened after the availability of more information in the form of the printing press. So in a sense, what we did has happened every time we've created new type of new branches of communication. Outrage was always baked into the business model. I think you're right. I think constructive co-creation, that if Minecraft is sort of our symbol for what a metaverse might be, that's a very powerful environment where every action creates to some extent.
Okay, I think we're pretty much at time. So just like one last question of like, where do you think the tipping point is for this kind of transition, where I know that it already exists for many people, right? We know the global gaming population is huge, but where do you think that tipping point is for it sort of really being fully registered that we have kind of transitioned and we no longer necessarily making these divisions between digital and physical space?
Last time I was here, I told you that technical problems needed to be solved. Part of why we did that demonstration is to say, whether it's us or somebody else, those are solvable problems now. So I think it boils down, as all big cultural transitions do, to a single application. If I knew what it was, I'd build it right now. But there's probably one or another application, one or another, for want of a better phrase, killer app that really opens people up to this type of thing. Cultural change tends to be like the dry powder builds up, and then it all just happens. And now with how connected we are, it can happen very quickly. If we think about how quickly Fortnite became a big thing versus how quickly WhatsApp became a big thing, these are order of magnitude differences in speed. So it may already be happening right now. This application may be in development. Maybe it'll be released in the next couple of months. There's there's really nothing stopping this occurring. We have enough connected people. We have enough gamers. We have enough opportunities to monetize and create value for people in that context. The technology is there. So, any minute is what I would say.
So keep an eye out. Okay, Thank you so much, Herman. And thank you for everybody that attended and for the great questions. I'll hand back to Layla now. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you so much, Ben and Herman, for joining us today and taking us into a completely different world. Herman, your live game scavengers event sounds like one of the coolest hybrid social experiments ever. Lots of food for thought. Is your sector ready to manage an experiment of that nature? Tell us your thoughts and feedback using hashtag cogX2021 and hashtag CreaTechUK. We will now take a short break. Do join us at 6 p.m. for our last CreaTech session of the day. It's going to be one of the best, so don't go anywhere. See you shortly.